All right, so, hey, I got a question for you. Who had to take full responsibility for the war?
Germany.
Yeah, Germany. They called the War Guilt Clause, and they were furious about this. Now, they deserved a lot of responsibility, don't get me wrong, but they had to take full responsibility, and that allowed them to punish him. What happened to Germany's army? Yeah, to 100,000 men. Remember, they started World War I. The day Britain declared war, they had 4.5 million men in uniform. They felt basically undefended. And especially with a very aggressive power to the east, two very aggressive powers. Poland was very aggressive too. And at 1919, 1920, also, they lost all of their what?
Ships.
Colonies, all their colonies. And what was the money they had to pay as to rebuild, but also to punish them so they can't do it again? What was the name of the money? This the generic name for the $33 billion they had to pay. Yeah, reparations. Reparations. Oh, so look back to the United States. Oh, what was the thing that Wilson created? And he thought it would be an international body would solve all the problems. Yeah. The U.S. never entered the League of Nations. What would be the kind of successor? In a lot of ways, almost direct successor to the League of Nations. Yeah, United Nations. But to avoid the problems that happened with the U.S. not entering the League of Nations, they kind of made the United Nations really weak, which it is right now. We'll talk about that. April. Isn't that exciting in April? We're going to be coming up fast, people. And who were the members of the Senate who refused to vote for any treaty because of the League of Nations? What was their name? Irreconcilables. Irreconcilables. Now, irreconcilables, they were absolutely opposed. On your DBQ, you don't have the irreconcilables, you can't get an A. There's no way I can give you an A on that. There's no way. And what was their big argument? What was a part of the treaty that's called collective security, which might mean the Americans U.S. might have to send troops. It's actually 10, Roman numeral 10. Or like Article X. I was in basketball in high school. This was the George Washington place. I have no idea why that was called George Washington. Article 10, collective security. Who were the people who wanted the treaty? Or I'm sorry, they would have voted for the treaty, but they demanded changes to the treaty. Reservationists. If you don't have reservationists, you can't get it. You just can't. If you can't explain that. And what person refused to change? Yeah, President Wilson. How many times did the Senate vote on the Treaty of Versailles? I'll give you a hint. It's between 1 and 1,000. 3. 2 with reservations, 1 without. All of them passed. All of them failed. Well, that's a new history. You got to have something on the votes. Got to have something on Wilson. Got to have those 3 things. And background materials, all the things from the treaty. It's a really good essay question. Your last DBQ will be on the reasons to drop the atomic bomb. You already know about that, which is a good way to do the last one. And we will get to all the things. Okay, so I'll come back to the treaty. Let's go and get there. So let's go and do. We did Rasputin, didn't we?
Yeah.
Did I tell you the story? Huh? We got here?
Yeah, we went through food riots. Yeah.
We get Kerensky?
Yeah, Kerensky was the last thing I had that you mentioned.
But, okay, so let's put down the thing about war. Oh, before we get to that, let's do a little bit more review. The United States entered the war. What was the telegram that tried to get Mexico in the war? Zimmerman, yep. What did Hindenburg and Ludendorff kind of foolishly start that would anger the Americans? They thought they could starve Britain. Restrict their food by unrestricted submarine warfare. Make the world safe for what? And also, what was the issue with bonds?
They weren't being paid back. in Mexico to US base, so then US air base to US base.
Not Mexico issue, but for the reason to go to war. Even though you're right about that.
It was Britain's.
Well, Britain wouldn't pay it back unless they did what? So that encouraged the United States to give it war. That'd be one of the biggest. Yes, you're right about basic diplomacy too. But I was thinking about the reason for war. And so Kerensky took power. And the Soviets had lost battle after battle. And so what they decided was this. Kerensky said, we have to stay in the war. We have to stay. We have to win a victory. In 1917, the reason the revolution took place, the biggest reason was to end the war. But Kerensky thought, we can't end the war until we have a victory so we can have a better peace agreement. This might remind you of something. Remember, in 1862, Lincoln realized we have to widen the war. We have to widen it. That means emancipation. But he needed a victory. The victory would come in Antietam. Kerensky thinks he needed a victory. So in 1917, there were huge offenses by the British here, the French here, the Italians here, and the Russians here. How did the offensives go for the Allies? Everyone failed. Italy was almost knocked out of the war. That's how bad they went. The Russian army advanced a little bit, and then the army just collapsed. It was a disaster. Kerensky staying in the war destroyed the government. Now, they're still technically in power, but almost immediately became unstable. And what group stepped in? The Bolsheviks. We're jumping right to here. The October Revolution. What a year, huh? The October Revolution, which happened in November of 1918. 1970. The Russians were still on the old Julian calendar. The Julian calendar every 4 years would be slow by a day because they didn't have a leap year. They wouldn't have to add the leap year to the 16th century with, I know what you're all thinking, the Gregorian calendar, right? Anybody know who Gregor was, by the way, the calendar named after? He was a pope. See, let's think of all the information you learn in here. Who was Julian of the Julian calendar? Yes, Julius Caesar. Yeah, Julius Caesar. So, no, we did not invent the calendar, but it was during his time as proconsul / dictator of Rome. So, the October Revolution. The Bolsheviks were a tiny group of communists. Now, Bolshevik actually means majority, so that was their propaganda to act like they're bigger. And the Bolsheviks were under a man by the name of Vladimir Lenin. And the thought was that they could use the war. They were overjoyed when the war began. Use the war to destabilize Russia and have a revolution in Russia, creating a perfect socialist state, which they thought the revolution could spread throughout the world. Now, according to Marx, there could not be true socialism in a state until they had the Industrial Revolution, and Russia was just beginning. So they thought they could kind of like engineer the revolution before Marx said it could happen. Same thing's going to happen in China. So the problem is this. Lenin, for his revolutionary activities, was in Switzerland when the war began. And so when the March Revolution hit, he's still in Switzerland. And he is agitating to end the war that was purely to get the capitalists rich. So you can imagine what the Germans are thinking. Lenin might be handy if he was out of Switzerland and Petrograd, the capital. And so when the March Revolution began, Kerensky took power, the faction around Kerensky, and they stayed in the war. Germany and Lenin began to talk. And Germany hated them. Why? Total war. Germany despised Lenin. If he would have been in Germany, they would have had him arrested. Yes, there was a huge socialist party in Germany, but who didn't like Lenin either, but most of them. But Lenin could be useful in Russia. Remember total war, to undermine the government and overthrow it. And so after the failed 1917 offensive, Lenin was spirited across Germany on trains. German trains provided with German money and German passage to Pomerania, up to Finland, which just won its independence from Russia in 1917 after the March Revolution, and then to Petrograd, where he could do his own revolution. The first attempt failed, but the second attempt in October/November, depending on what calendar you're using, worked. And look at this very simple slogan of the Bolsheviks. Bread, peace, and love. Starving, end the war, and most Russians were peasants, and they did not own their land. They didn't abandon serfdom, which is a legacy of feudalism. They didn't abandon serfdom until 1860, but most peasants were, the closest analogy would be like a sharecropper. And they promised them your own land, peace, food, will end the war. And people were so tired of the war, it worked. Just a couple thousand Bolsheviks took over the largest country in the world. It's kind of amazing. A bloodless coup where they just basically occupied the government buildings in Petrograd, but they also knew they needed the religious capital of Russia. What was the religious capital? Moscow. And they took those over, and because there was a vacuum now in power as the Kerensky government collapsed, they're in power. And what did they do almost immediately? Oh, this is Lenin right here. Before we get to that, the leader, the organizer of the revolution, and the leader of the Bolsheviks, soon to be called the Red Army, is this man right here, Leon Trotsky. He actually wasn't a Bolshevik, but he allied with him because he wanted the war over. He would be the first really big hero after Lenin. This is Lenin right here. Lenin, Trotsky. And Stalin, right here, was actually a leading member, but had very little to do with the revolution. But Stalin would be a tireless organizer, brilliant man. Also the most paranoid man ever to live. And if you know anything about Stalin, that's really probably true. But a tireless organizer who would work behind the scenes to gather power. And Trotsky was the hero, never understood that Stalin was gunning for him to take power after Lenin passed away. And to give you an idea what happened here, this is right after the revolution. And they took power. And here's Lenin and Trotsky right next to each other, the heroes of the Russian Revolution. After Stalin took power and exiled Trotsky, see the picture? Here's the picture you would find in Russia, the Soviet Union, by the 1930s. That's 1918. See it? Where's Trotsky? They literally painted him out. They just painted him out. They disappeared. And this shows a totalitarian state. They began to adapt the history to make it their own. Stalin wanted to be in charge, and so he got rid of Trotsky. I should add, by 1934, you did not mention the name Trotsky unless you were saying Trotsky must die. If you said Trotsky was a hero of the revolution, what would happen to you? If I said that in class, let's put it this way, you'd have a new teacher tomorrow. And all of you would act like I never existed. Because one of you would have ratted on me, right? Of course, I'm filming this. So a lot of people would have ratted on me. So back to this. Immediately, the Soviet Union, Russia, now under Bolshevik control, signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany. And this treaty was a clear German victory. A clear German victory. The Russians had to pull back from all this territory here. And the Germans created puppet governments in Latvia, Lithuania. Today it's called Belarus, but back then they called it White Russia and Ukraine. All were created as, and Poland, almost forgot, they created a new Poland. All under Russian control. But here's the big deal for the Western allies and now the United States. Russia, out of the war, means Germany could pull over 1 million troops and move them to the West. Before large numbers of American troops can come. This is huge. You can imagine how angry the United States, Britain, France were at the new Russian government. They would never forget this. And all through the Cold War, this would be brought up as a, you can't trust the Soviet Union. Because look what they did. They abandoned us in the war, and Germany nearly won in 1918. So, in Russia would trigger a horrible civil war. The worst years of the war were 1918 and 1921, but technically it lasted until 1924. It was a bloody war. Millions of Russian civilians would either be killed or removed from their homes. Both sides would soon adopt the most horrible techniques of total war and also the most brutal imaginable treatment of prisoners. Everything from torture, execution. There's stories of wrapping prisoners up in barbed wire and rolling them down hills to get them to talk. Yeah, that is, you start thinking about that, that's unimaginable, isn't it? Brutal war. The Bolsheviks would soon be called the Reds, the color of patriots' blood. So this would become, that was known as the color of socialism after the Paris Commune of 1871, but soon it'd be, the color of the Soviet Union. And the whites were the anti-Bolsheviks. The problem the whites had were some wanted the monarchy, some wanted the republic, some wanted a combination. They weren't unified. Some were just like Ukrainians who wanted to be independent. Heck, some of the whites were the thousands of Austro-Hungarian prisoners that just happened to be there. Here's red propaganda of here are the capitalists getting rich off the war, and now notice how they come big, he's getting rich, and the Bolsheviks killing him. Here's white propaganda, and look at the monster of the Reds. That's actually really kind of scary picture. So, the Allies intervened on the side of the whites. Every great power would send troops to go fight against the Bolsheviks and help the whites win. So the British sent forces, the British and French sent forces down here. Japan invaded Vladivostok and began to advance on the Trans-Siberian Railroad. Italians sent troops to the Crimea. Everybody sent troops to try to help the whites. Yeah. Their fear was not just anger that they left the war, but that this socialist revolution might spread. There was a growing socialist movement in France, in England, and don't forget the United States had a very active socialist party. Debs got over 1 million votes in 1912. And the thought was this communist revolt might spread to socialist revolts elsewhere, including US intervention. The United States sent troops to Vladivostok and Murmansk. Now, I know it's kind of hard to see, but Murmansk is right here, way up here. Montana National Guardsmen were sent there. They thought they were going to France, and the next thing they told them is, hey, you're going north of the Arctic Circle to go fight our former allies. And like, what? Those are Montana National Guardsmen in Murmansk. Those poor guys, they did fight. There were a few battles with the Reds, but for the most part, though, they sat there and shivered. The intervention failed, and write this down. The Reds won the Civil War by 1921. But two things. One thing, the whites almost took Petrograd. And so the Bolsheviks moved the capital. They didn't want their capital to be taken. Petrograd, which is today called St. Petersburg again. Where did they move the capital to? The religious capital of Moscow. And they took over a massive, best way to describe it is a cathedral for the Orthodox Church. You might have heard of it, called the Kremlin. And that became the seat of government, still is. Next thing. How many of you knew that Montana, the US, let alone Montanans, invaded Russia to help revolutionaries defeat the government? How many knew about that? You know what? I mean, I'm not blaming you. This is why we take the class, right? Does anyone know? Maybe one? What country do you suppose everybody in school knows. Yes. All through the Cold War in the Soviet Union, they would tell their kid from day one, the United States hates you. They invaded once, and what? And what are they still taught in Russia? Even though they're no longer anything close to the Soviet Union anymore. But they hated you, they invaded you once, and they're going to do it again. After World War II, 1949, what is the military alliance that the United States created in Northern Europe, or Western Europe? NATO. We're still in NATO. Excuse me. One of the reasons Russia said, to invade Ukraine was that Ukraine was going to join NATO and it was going to be part of the United States attack on Russia. That's one of the reasons they gave. They talk about it all the time. Putin talked about it just the other day when he was interviewed by, I don't know what to call it, an American propagandist named Tucker Carlson. But he said that it was NATO. I mean, that's a point. He definitely has a point of view. He said, Putin said, we invaded Ukraine because Ukraine was going to become part of NATO and they're going to attack the United States. Now, that's patently ridiculous. But why would Russians believe that? Because what have they been taught from day one? That's how history works. Now, that's not what the United States is going to do, but you control history. You control what people think is about their past, and you can get people to do stuff and believe stuff. Russians believe what he said. It's patently ridiculous. Patently. But they believe it. Gee, could we believe stuff like that too here? Of course. So the Bolsheviks won, and eventually they would create the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Everybody calls it the Soviet Union. Think about Soviet as a revolutionary council, a revolutionary workers group. And their stated goals, they were going to create this perfect socialist world where the workers control the means of production through the state. Will control it for the workers, but the state will wither away. That's what they said. And we have a classless society. And they would use this rhetoric for the entire time of the Soviet Union, talking about proletarians, which are workers. But remember what I told you about this when I told you about Marx, way back when. After the revolution, there has to be a dictatorship of the proletariat, aka the workers. So the leaders of the revolution will create a dictatorship, and then when the people are ready for perfect socialism and capitalism has been destroyed, then the dictatorship will end and it'll be perfect democracy. When did the dictatorship of the proletariat end for the Soviet Union? Oh, it did end, 1991, when the Soviet Union completely and totally collapsed. Once they got power, they never gave up power. And especially during the Civil War, the Red forces, the Bolsheviks, adopted all the tools of total war to win that war, and they never gave them up. The entire time they were in power, they used the tools of total war, creating what kind of state? Totalitarian. And so here are all the heroes of the workers, and I show here are all the workers with Marx, Engels, Lenin, and then Stalin, who would win a power struggle with Trotsky after Lenin died. Now, we will come back to them and the monstrous state that Joseph Stalin is going to create. But here's the deal. Communism and socialism were small political parties, maybe some labor unions, but on the periphery, or some crazy anarchists who are blowing things up. Remember all the assassinations. After 1921, when they won, it's the largest country in the world says they're communist. And they talk about revolution. Now they're a real country and a real potential threat to those in power. Especially, anybody know what that's a picture of? So that's the flag they would adopt, red, the hammer and sickle. And this was someone, when I was talking about the horrible state that the Soviets created, they gave me the flag, so I put it up. They're gone. Even though I do find it amusing when Russian soldiers today in Ukraine will pull this flag out. Why do they pull it out? The same reason I'm showing you that picture. Where's that guy holding that flag? Where is it? That's the Reichstag. The parliament in Berlin. And that's 1945. And the Soviet Union crushed the German army that no one thought could be beat. They could crush the German army. Oh my gosh. How could little old United States even come close to them? Now it's a legitimate power. That's the beginning of the Cold War. All right. Hey, let's come back to the Soviets. You want to come back to them? I bet we'll have a couple more stories about them in the future. So, what about America at war? So we had to unify the war. So here's the U-boats getting us into the war. Here's the whole idea is wake up America. We've been asleep while civilization is at risk. They'll have almost identical posters in 1942. Almost identical. So the first thing is we had to mobilize. And we have to mobilize the economy. And this was not an easy thing to do. You know, here is get more ships. So, first thing, financing. Got to pay for this thing. The United States is still on the gold standard. If you're on a gold standard, that limits your flexibility with your currency because you always have to tie your money to the amount of gold you have on hand. It really hamstrings a government. If your currency is based on something that you cannot control, like gold, or in Europe it's euros, if you can't control it as a country, it hamstrings you. So the first two things they did is progressive taxation. So they dramatically increased the number of tax brackets, and progressive taxation means the higher your income, what happens to the tax rates? They go up. Everyone got that? If you did not know that, make sure you get that. Eventually the highest marginal tax rate by 1918 would be just under 70%. Now, nobody pays even close to 70%. That's not how marginal taxes work, but that's the highest tax rate. And they begin to borrow money by issuing bonds. So they had a twofold thing. Had to borrow money and issue bonds. Here they try to get just regular people, not banks or investors, to buy it. They call them Liberty bonds. In World War II, they call them war bonds. Today, you can still buy them called savings bonds. Same thing. So basically, you're buying them, you're loaning money to the government, and then they pay you back sometime down the road. And here's the poster saying, buy Liberty bonds. Why? After a Zeppelin raid in London. So a father and daughter are crying because the raid killed his wife, her mother. Oh yeah, see the body right there, yeah? Now what does that mean? Implying that if we don't win the war and reinvest, that's what's going to happen here. So, the problem with this is, inflation went up at 100%. 100% inflation. Because overnight, all the money in the economy, or I'm sorry, all this money now going to the government is buying everything. The government needs everything. It needs all the food, it needs the clothing, it needs the steel, but more important, companies that were making consumer goods, like Henry Ford was making Model T Fords. And now he is going to be made to make artillery carriages. So what happened to the price of the remaining Model T Fords if they're not making them anymore? All those consumer goods, the price is skyrocketing. Every war, the government demand pushes out consumer spending. And therefore, demand went up. And then, to organize the economy, they didn't know what to do about the inflation. Prices doubled. And wages did not keep up. This would become a crisis in 1919. The United States did a significantly better job with the Roosevelt administration during World War II, kind of learning from the problems of World War I. They did a lot better in World War II, but it's still a problem in World War II. So they created a series of war boards, and I didn't write this down, so I had this. Before you bribe companies, they thought they could control the entire economy. This would organize the entire economy. And they thought they would give lucrative contracts, so big profit, aka bribing companies with big profit contracts if they would switch from consumer goods to military goods. So they would control the economy and then literally, hey, we're going to give you so much money you won't know what to do with. And so those were the war boards. And they did everything, transportation board, labor board, all these administrations. There are two you have to know. One, the War Industries Board. Bernard Baruch was a financier, and Wilson put him forward because he thought this financial banker, this investment banker, could organize the resources. And so they would go to all these different companies and make sure, okay, you're not all going to try to produce everything. You produce artillery. You produce this ammunition. You produce rifles. You produce planes. And they're given them big contracts to do it. There was a lot of resistance. Men like Henry Ford didn't care. All he cared about was making money. And he was making a heck of a lot of money producing Model T Fords and didn't want to make trucks for the war. He'd do the same thing in World War II. And he actually actively helped Nazi Germany, Henry Ford. Henry Ford's an interesting guy. We will get to him. Hitler really liked Henry Ford. But he was shockingly anti-Semitic. So it took a long time to get companies to do this, and they resisted it. They wanted to keep making money. Patriots. So did the War Industries Board work? So they would try to do that, yeah, and they would arrest some eventually when the bribery didn't work. So you're on the right track. But if you have to arrest them, that means they spent a long time not building the stuff. The United States did not producing large amounts of munitions and equipment for war until early 1919. Okay, you're just looking at me dumbfounded. What's wrong with that? The war was over. The war was over. The United States, most of the weapons we used were made in Britain and France. Our biggest hero of the war, Alvin York, who single-handedly captured 130 Germans with one rifle. His rifle was a British Enfield rifle. Eddie Rickenbacker, the leading American ace with 26 German planes he shot down, was flying a French SPAD-10 plane. Almost all of them. I showed you a picture of an American with a machine gun. It's a French machine gun. The war boards failed miserably. Now, there's going to be kind of this remembering of the war boards kind of positively because we won the war, but it didn't work. The only one of this administrations that would work, they didn't have enough teeth to make them. I should have had in World War II, they made them. The head of General Motors was arrested and put in jail for not building planes and tanks for the Army in 1942. So World War II, they dealt with it. So the only one that really worked was the Food Administration, partially because prices were high, farmers were making money. Herbert Hoover, a young engineer known as a very able administrator, organized food, and this was a massive success. We organized the farms to grow food that was necessary for the war, not for profit. And not only that, Hoover would convince millions of Americans to grow gardens, plow up their backyards wherever they could and grow gardens, or on roofs of buildings and apartment buildings in New York City or big cities, and grow gardens to supplement the war effort. And it was an amazing success. Herbert Hoover, here he is yelling at someone wealthy, eating a fancy dinner, and basically, no, we got to save that money for the troops in the war. Hoover's going to come out of this war with a stellar reputation as an able administrator. Hoover's going to have a different reputation in about 12 years. Hoover will be president when the Great Depression begins. And his inaction will turn it into Hoover's depression. Well, what about the volunteer army? The idea was, much like Britain, the United States would just pour out troops to go fight this war. They assumed 1 to 2 million volunteers. Here are volunteers at the recruiting office in New York City just a couple days after the declaration of war. And the assumption was, we're going to have to build camps all over and build this army. Well, recruitment was huge in the first couple days and then fell off the face of the earth. By the end of April, nobody was volunteering. They only had about 100,000 volunteers. Nobody volunteered. This might shock you. The young men of the United States really didn't want to go fight and die in a trench. What the heck is wrong with them? Yes, this splendid little war and get maimed. Now, as we all know, women are in combat today. So that meant all of you could have volunteered for this war. Who's ready to go? Who's with me? Are you afraid? Let's go fight for our country. Now, I can say that because I'm far too old, so I'll let you fight and die for me. Isn't that convenient for me? I'm all for this. Come on, I would have done it. Right? Just agree.
Yes.
Yeah, you don't have to go. You can stay with me. You'll be my age. So, nobody joined. And anti-war movement was pretty strong. Here's a piece of sheet music. It was actually done in 1916 with the whole thing we're staying out of the war, but would become relatively popular when the war began. I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier. And recruitment posters, all those things they tried to do didn't work. I just put this one up because I really like it. Join the tank, United States Army Tank Corps. And I like the broadcast. I like that poster. Don't you like it? You got to admit, that's pretty cool, right? Come on, you got to admit that. So, no one's volunteering. Wilson is furious. Are they not volunteering because they don't believe we should go to war? Or are the Germans already winning? They already overthrew one government. Are they winning? What do you call? So they would initiate, he would ask Congress much earlier than he wanted to for selective service. Selective service is the what? Draft. And almost immediately, there were anti-draft protests all over. And immediately, people started saying, is that pro-German? Are these things being done by German agents all over? Are this being done by people who want to overthrow the government? And Wilson, who, remember, he didn't want the war back in 1916. But once he committed, he's all in. Wilson was the type of man that he believed if he made the decision, his decision was on the side of the angels. And it could be no wrong. And how dare you disagree? He couldn't stomach people who disagreed with him. Wilson's an interesting guy. And so, Wilson believed this must be pro-German activity. There must be spies all over that are organizing resistance. Spies, spying. What's the name for spying again? I wonder what's coming. And so, here is telling young men to register. Here, fighting against it. A meeting against war, but it's against the draft. It's all against the draft. Here, soldiers break up big peace meeting in Seattle. The peace meeting, anti-draft, anti-selective service. And by the way, isn't that kind of weird? Soldiers break up peace meeting. Just the whole, thought, if you think about it, wow, that's interesting. That's actually done by lottery, so that's the first person drafted, the first birthday. We would do the same thing in World War II, and then in Vietnam after 1969, every birthday is assigned a number 1 to 365. Just assigned a random number. And they just would pick it out of the thing, 1 to 365, and the lower the number, that means you're drafted first. So, Wilson decided to adopt all the measures of total war overnight. And the first thing was, we need social unity. We must rally the population for war. And they set up, it was originally called the Office of Public Information, but everybody called it the Creel Commission. And this would be a propaganda. Office of Public Information reminds me of the French Revolution. But George Creel was a movie producer. And so they thought he could understand how to appeal to people with the new motion picture industry. And so they did all kinds of propaganda to push patriotism and the war and fighting the war, but also the biggie, to imply that there are enemy all over that are trying to undermine our war effort. and they live right amongst you. They might even be family members, people you trust. And we can't identify them. They don't come out and tell you they're German, but they're trying to destroy the war effort. They promoted fear. Here's one of their propaganda movies. They made a bunch of these, under 4 flags. These are all the Allied powers. They have these speakers come around and give these pat little short speeches to businesses, to community meetings. They would go into schools and talk to people, and they call them, because there's a short speech, 4-Minute Men. Remember the Minutemen from the Revolutionary War? Clever name, the 4-Minute Men. Quick speeches, not just to rally the country, but to imply anybody who's against the draft, they're against the war and they want you to lose. Therefore, they're what? Huh? Well, they might be, but we're fighting the Germans, remember? They might be German, and if they're against us and want us to lose, what are they? They're enemies and they're traitors. And so, that's why they passed the Espionage Act. Why's your phone on? The Espionage Act. Why? To shut people up about the draft. When you read that, you notice all the things about military service. It's the draft. And the next year they passed even a stronger one called the Sedition Act. Sedition is criticism of the government. Now that one had a time limit, so that one's away, but the Espionage Act still with us. And who is the target? Anybody they might see as pro-German. And who might be pro-German? I don't know. There are millions of people in the United States whose ancestors were German immigrants. Could they be trusted? Why didn't they change their name to an American name, whatever that means? If your name is obviously German, are you really an American? And they began to attack people with German names. I don't mean the government, I mean just citizens. They got them riled up. And they began to beat people up with names like Schmidt. In fact, thousands of people with names like Schmidt changed their name to Smith. They didn't want to be beaten up. My great-grandfather's name was Schutz, and this is my mom's side. They had a store named Schutz's, little tiny corner market, back when they used to have corner markets. Free everyone had cars. And it was called Schutz's. And they had a big window, that's where you put all your goods in. It was broken a dozen times. People came in and started breaking stuff, calling him a traitor. Now, he was an honorary cuss and wouldn't change his name, but my grandma remembers how scary that was. She was just a little girl. Remembers how really scared that was, being called this. They were attacked, homes burnt down. If you had a dachshund, the odds are someone's going to kill it. That's a German dog. That'd be one of the symbols of war, would be a hanging dachshund outside of someone's home. Or German shepherds, things like that. But that wasn't, dachshunds were much, German shepherds really weren't around much yet. But also socialists. Socialists were opposed to the war. And so they targeted them. Eugene Debs was totally opposed to this war, as he saw it as workers killing workers, while capitalists get rich. And so, this would spread. Last thing you're gonna write down, look at this poster. Not write down, but this is a great poster then showing what they want. And you notice all these individuals walking, and then they turn into the soldiers. And you notice they're all dressed the same. Here's the big thing to look at. Watch this. It just becomes a line. You're no longer an individual anymore. You're part of a mass to fight for your country. Anybody want to guess what's going to be the ideal of a totalitarian state? The mass. Now, I will tell you tomorrow.
We are going to have to probably ban the edition.